Imagine the cold tang of rusted iron on your tongue. In a dim medieval room, a heavy pair of pliers is clamping shut on a rotting molar. There is no anesthesia, no sterilized tray. There is only a firm grip, a violent twist, and a scream that hits the mud floor. Before modern medicine, daily life was defined by this kind of unavoidable physical agony. A single infected tooth could swell your jaw and poison your blood within days. In this world, decay acted as a terrifying, inescapable equalizer for everyone from the plowman to the priest. If you were suffering, you sought out the local blacksmith or barber surgeon. They operated with the same tools used for horseshoes and stubborn nails. These weren't instruments of healing, they were weapons of mercy, designed to pull the pain out by force. Because this suffering felt so arbitrary and cruel, people invented a monster to explain it, the toothworm. They convinced themselves that tiny, invisible beasts were burrowing through their enamel. This myth acted as a psychological placebo. It's easier to fight a worm than to accept that your own body is rotting. Wealth offered no protection. In fact, European nobles who could afford expensive luxuries like honeyed bread and candied fruits saw their mouths decay far faster than those of the peasants. They lived in palaces, yet their smiles resembled crumbling graveyards. Human biology is a baseline of vulnerability. We are born soft and prone to decay. Our earliest instinct is to build a narrative or a physical layer over that reality, creating a distance between ourselves and our own fragility. We moved from crude animal skins to social architecture. Clothing evolved into humanity's first technology, a way to distance the body from the earth and project a chosen status. It became our first social shield. In ancient Egypt, the elite projected power through labor-intensive linen. It was smooth, bleached, and immaculate. To produce this fabric, flax had to be soaked, beaten, and spun with grueling precision. Wearing these pristine pleats signaled their distance from the grime and sweat of manual labor. In China, the facade was woven from silk. It was light, luminous, and held dyes with a depth other fabrics couldn't match. Silk production was a strictly guarded secret, used as an instrument of imperial control. Your rank was dictated by the embroidery you wore: dragons for emperors, clouds for scholars. Rome codified identity into the toga. This massive, semicircular woolen cloth was bulky and required a servant to wrap properly. It was entirely impractical for working. Only a citizen could wear it, making fabric a legal identifier of rank and political weight. But these pristine outward appearances were an illusion. A noble could be swathed in perfumed silk and immaculate linen, yet the moment they opened their mouths to speak, they revealed the exact same festering rot as a beggar in the street. Clothing is a social illusion, allowing us to invent hierarchies and project an image of divinity, masking the shared biological decay that we all carry beneath the fabric. In the 1920s, the United States was caught between the wreckage of World War I and the dizzying pace of industrial change. It was a nation searching for a permanent, unifying story that wouldn't dissolve into the gears of the modern age. Sculptor Gutzon Borglum saw an opportunity to carve that story into the earth itself. He proposed a shrine to democracy, choosing 4 presidents to represent the birth, expansion, and development of the American Republic, carved at a scale meant to outlast time. This wasn't an act of quiet artistry, it was industrial violence. For 14 years, 400 laborers blasted and drilled the granite. They used dynamite to shave away layers of the mountain, forcing these massive presidential faces into existence with precision and grit. But to the Lakota Sioux, this was Pahasapa, the sacred heart of their world. This mountain range was legally guaranteed to them by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, promised as their land forever. That promise was broken the moment gold was found in the hills. The land was seized, and the monument immortalized the leaders who oversaw indigenous displacement and the expansion of settler colonialism. Mount Rushmore operates on the same principle as the toga or the toothworm. It is a massive facade blasted into stone to overwrite an uncomfortable, ugly historical reality with a triumphant national myth. There is a direct line from masking a rotting tooth to wearing a silk robe to dynamiting a mountain. We share a deep, ancient terror of our own physical vulnerability and the ugliness of our past actions. It is a behavioral constant that spans millennia. We manufacture survival mechanisms. We use prayers to manage pain, fabric to invent status, and dynamite to carve national innocence into stolen rock. These grand myths capture our imagination and define our civilizations, but they always sit on top of a foundation of hidden suffering. To understand our true history, we must look past the polished granite and the pristine silk and stare directly at the uncomfortable, rotting scars beneath. Imagine an 18th century European queen. She is draped in priceless silk, adorned with jewels, and standing perfectly still while a small mouse scurries out from the back of her towering powdered wig. Underneath the floral perfume, she smells of old cheese and unwashed sweat. Modern audiences often assume that absolute wealth buys absolute comfort. A billionaire has the softest bed and the cleanest water. However, for much of human history, extreme privilege required enduring specific, deliberate forms of physical misery. The elites lived in a constant state of friction. As human beings, they shared a biological need for warmth, cleanliness, and nutrition. But as rulers, they faced a societal demand to look as different from the peasant class as possible. Throughout history, the daily routines of the ruling class leaned into these collisions, creating an environment where the demand for status frequently overrode the basic human need for comfort. In ancient Rome, elite status was projected through massive architectural engineering aimed squarely at hygiene. This diagram shows a cross-section of a Roman bathhouse. Engineers built roaring underground furnaces that pushed hot air through a subfloor grid of pillars and up into wall flues. They used these systems to conquer physical comfort on a massive scale, inventing central heating to keep thousands of citizens sweating in warm, steamy rooms. These towering brick ruins demonstrate the sheer scale of the spaces required for Roman social rituals. The bathhouse functioned as a primary arena for networking, political gossip, and elite deal-making. A citizen went in to be scraped with oil and emerged with a newly forged political alliance. Across the world in Edo, Japan, status was dictated by a rigid hierarchy of food rather than architecture. Inside the licensed pleasure quarters, dining was an exclusive performance. These elite figures sat on a raised platform overlooking the water, physically isolated from the common laborers below. Every dish in a kaiseki meal emphasized seasonal harmony and immense wealth. This focus on exclusivity led to a medical irony. Wealthy elites indulged in refined, polished white rice, which stripped the grain of vitamins. They frequently suffered from beriberi, while resource-starved peasants survived on brown rice and wild greens, unknowingly maintaining superior nutrition. In both Rome and Japan, the elite endured immense logistical friction to project power, but their methods, bathing in heated halls and dining on curated plates, still vaguely served the requirements of human survival. The transition to medieval France marked a shift where elite routines moved away from practicality toward pure theater. French nobility weaponized prohibitively expensive ingredients. They drowned savory dishes like roasted venison and fish in cinnamon, cloves, and heavy layers of sugar. Since they had access to fresh food, these spices served to prove they could afford to waste commodities shipped from across the globe. The kitchen focused on edible trickery. Chefs built rock-hard pastry coffins, designed as storage containers rather than food, engineering them to hold live birds or actors that would emerge mid-feast. This chart breaks down humoral theory, a pseudoscientific belief that the body was governed by 4 fluids: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Chefs used this to justify violently conflicting flavors. If meat was cold, They aggressively balanced it by adding hot, sweet sugar. These meals functioned as sensory assaults, demonstrating that the host possessed the wealth required to ignore the rules of nature. By 18th century Europe, the elite abandoned biological self-preservation. Physicians convinced the ruling class that hot water opened the plague, leading royal women to stop bathing. They managed the resulting odor with suffocating perfumes, gallons of floral oils and ambergris designed to mask the reality of their unwashed bodies and clothing. Their beauty routines took a physical toll. Women applied Venetian ceruse, a paste of white lead and vinegar, which caused their skin to peel and develop sores. Meanwhile, chronic sugar consumption left their teeth blackened and rotting, forcing them to mash their meals just to swallow. Look at the exaggerated width and height of the hairstyles in this caricature. These wigs stood over a foot tall and were heavily powdered with flour. Because they were never washed, they became traps for head lice, requiring the invention of bejeweled louse sticks for public scratching. The flour and animal fat in these unwashed structures attracted nesting mice, forcing women to sleep in wire cages. The suffering extended to their clothing. This massive volume of pink fabric represents layers of unwashable corsets and petticoats that trapped body heat, sweat, and toxic textile dyes directly against the skin. The royal body became a landscape for these displays. Health and basic sanity were secondary to the political silhouette. A parasite-infested wig or a rotting smile was not viewed as a failure of hygiene. In a royal court, it signaled a successful detachment from the peasantry. The accumulation of historical power demanded a specific tax, the obligation to perform inside a toxic, itchy uniform. While the tools have changed, the underlying drive to use the body as a stage for status remains intact. The willingness to endure deep physical discomfort for the sake of social superiority is not a relic of the past, but a permanent, unshakable fixture of human culture. To survive the ancient world, you had to accept one immediate, overwhelming truth. Your environment was actively trying to kill you. Staying alive required a grueling, daily struggle against freezing winters, starvation, and the constant threat of violence. Consider the life of a Viking shield maiden. Born in the dead of winter in a smoke-filled longhouse, her survival was already a statistical anomaly. In a fiercely martial society, arriving as a girl meant her life was an immediate gamble. There was no gentle childhood. Her early education consisted of observing exhausted adults, avoiding open fires, and learning how to grip a blade. Her first toy was likely a discarded animal bone, and her primary lesson was simple: never show weakness. By her 12th birthday, her transition to adulthood was marked by the weight of cold steel. She was handed her primary tool of survival, an iron-bladed axe, heavy enough to split logs, bone, and any lingering doubts about her strength. When she finally joined a raiding crew, the reality was claustrophobic and exhausting. Packed elbow to elbow with hardened veterans, she rode through freezing storms until her hands blistered, staring up at a towering wooden prow, designed to intimidate whatever shoreline they struck next. In the mud and chaos of her first raid, she swung that axe until the handle splintered. She collected deep aches, cracked ribs, and visible scars. By refusing to drop her weapon when the shield wall broke, she forced the village elders to stop seeing her as a liability and start relying on her as a veteran. For our earliest ancestors, confronting physical violence head-on served as the first pillar of endurance. By fighting back, they carved a distinct, undeniable identity into a world that offered them nothing. Defeating an enemy you can see is one thing, but ancient populations lived in constant terror of threats they couldn't hit with a sword. Plagues, sudden fevers, and chronic misfortune struck down the strongest warriors overnight, bringing an overwhelming sense of random, invisible chaos. To fight these unseen forces, cultures engineered entirely new systems of defense. If you fell sick in ancient Greece, you traveled to a massive marble sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the the god of healing. You would sleep on the floor in a dark chamber, a process called incubation, hoping to receive a divine dream where a deity provided a diagnosis. Further east in Mesopotamia, illness was viewed as a personal attack by malicious spirits. Their remedy required physically trapping the entity in a clay bowl. Scribes covered these clay incantation bowls in complex Aramaic spells intended to bind the demon. The bowl was then buried upside down beneath the threshold of a home, acting as a spiritual bouncer to catch the entity before it could cross inside. Other societies mapped these unseen threats as blockages in a flowing natural ecosystem. Traditions like Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine treated illness as a disruption in the body's energy, like qi or doshas, requiring precise physical adjustments to restore harmony and smooth flow. Whether relying on a temple, a clay trap, or a map of cosmic energy, ancient healing served as the second pillar of endurance. It functioned as a psychological tool, allowing people to impose human order onto a random universe. Yet even if you survived the winter and outmaneuvered a plague, there was one threat no weapon or spell could defeat: time. Escaping a sword or a fever only delayed the eventual erasure of death. Our earliest attempt to outlast time began over 75,000 years ago. Early humans painstakingly carved holes into tiny mollusk shells, stringing them together. These pierced shells served as early humanity's first portable language, communicating lineage and status to anyone who saw them. As civilizations expanded, so did the ambition to outlast death. Ancient empires engineered jewelry into spiritual armor. Egyptian pharaohs were buried in heavy collars and masks made of solid gold and lapis lazuli, materials believed to be the flesh and hair of the gods, designed to protect the soul in the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, elite rulers layered themselves in precious metals to enforce social hierarchies. A heavy gold floral crown displayed immense wealth, while serving as a public declaration of divine favor, separating the monarchs from the mortals they ruled. In ancient China, the elite turned to jade. Valued for its purifying properties, emperors were entombed in full body suits made of thousands of pieces of hand-cut jade, believing the stone would physically prevent their bodies from rotting. This is the third pillar of endurance. We invented jewelry to code our identity, our political power, and our beliefs into materials that cannot rot. We built monuments you could wear, trusting they would carry our stories forward long after our bodies scaled. To see how these three pillars combine in the modern era, we look beneath the quiet wheat fields of northern France. Here lies Naours, a hidden subterranean city carved directly into soft chalk, stretching for miles in total darkness. The site originated as a functional refuge, engineered for survival against the threat above. During medieval conflicts, entire villages would descend into these caverns, waiting in silence while invading armies burned their homes. Centuries later, during the First World War, this refuge intersected with the most mechanized slaughter humanity had ever seen. Allied soldiers fighting nearby used the caves for brief periods of rest, stepping out of the artillery fire and into the cold chalk. When modern archaeologists explored the deepest tunnels, they found thousands of names, ranks, and dates meticulously carved into the walls by those resting soldiers. A moment of wonder. Facing the prospect of erasure, these men executed the deepest human reflex, leaving undeniable physical proof that they existed. From the rusted iron of a Viking axe to the fired clay of a demon trap, the polished jade of an emperor's tomb, and the scratched chalk of a soldier's signature, the materials change, but the intention remains identical. Human history represents a deliberate architecture of legacy, built to survive the tragedies that once defined it. We endure the physical, the invisible, and the passage of time, because humanity possesses a relentless obsession with carving our names into an indifferent universe. In the modern world, adolescence is a protected sanctuary, a sanctioned window for self-discovery and low-stakes rebellion. But step back on the historical timeline, and that gentle transition period vanishes. Society treated the volatile energy of youth as a raw material in need of aggressive engineering. It was a resource to be harvested rather than a phase to be nurtured. To manage this energy, empires utilized specific mechanisms of control: immediate civic responsibility, rigidly manufactured destinies, elaborate emotional protocols, and the authority of medical science. Growing up meant navigating a gauntlet of societal constraints that prioritized the stability of the state over the agency of the individual. Ancient Rome relied on sensory and societal immersion to eliminate childhood. Adolescents lived in a world of constant noise and public scrutiny, centered in the Roman Forum, the massive stone heart of the city's civic life. At 13, Roman boys exchanged their childhood tunics for the toga virilis. This heavy garment was a physical burden designed to signal adulthood. Managing its folds in public was a daily test of civic dignity. For 13-year-old Roman girls, childhood suddenly ended through the demands of household management. They were thrust into marriage negotiations and expected to command the logistics of a complex villa, from supervising staff to managing the family accounts. The expectations were unrelenting: mastering rhetoric, spinning flax, navigating political alliances, and surviving the gaze of a city that treated public behavior as a professional sport. Rome demanded maturity immediately. It utilized the weight of public duty to absorb youthful energy before it could ever turn toward rebellion. In Macedonia, the royal court at Pella utilized a different mechanism, controlling youth by manufacturing a destiny that could not be escaped. King Philip II exposed his son to the realities of war from his earliest years. He forced Alexander to observe military councils, study battlefield trauma, and share the hardships of common soldiers in the Macedonian hills. In order to refine this raw martial energy, King Philip summoned the philosopher Aristotle. The philosopher provided the intellectual foundation for conquest, teaching Alexander how to weaponize logic, ethics, and persuasion to govern a unified world. Young Alexander viewed the heroes of the Iliad as his actual ancestry. He lived with the conviction that the blood of Achilles and Heracles flowed through his veins, a belief reinforced daily by his parents and his tutor. Alexander was never allowed to be a boy. His identity was overwritten by the requirements of a future empire, leaving no room for a self that existed outside of conquest. Medieval European youth found their agency suppressed by arranged property alliances. Nobility viewed marriage as a transactional move for land and power, leaving teenagers locked in rigid, loveless unions before they reached adulthood. To prevent this frustration from destabilizing the feudal system, the aristocracy developed a pressure valve: courtly love. This system allowed for romance, but only through intense devotion to someone unattainable. It transformed forbidden passion into a sport, regulated by a complex set of rules that required knights to worship their ladies from a distance. Troubadours turned this yearning into a public performance. Their songs established a culture where the highest form of love was unfulfilled, redirecting dangerous youthful emotions into a monitored social ritual. Courtly love neutralized the threat of rebellion. It converted forbidden desire into a philosophical exercise that ultimately reinforced the same hierarchy it seemed to challenge. By the 19th century, the mechanism of control shifted to the clinical authority of medical science. Victorian doctors used the veneer of science to suppress ambition and female agency. The medical establishment popularized hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis used to punish women who displayed frustration or independent thought. The diagnosis covered nearly any deviation from Victorian norms: being too active, too tired, reading novels, riding horses, or wanting education were all classified as disease symptoms. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell enforced this control through the infamous rest cure. He prescribed weeks of forced inactivity, forbidding patients from reading, writing, or visitors to restore a sense of feminine passivity. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a victim of this treatment, described the rest cure as psychological imprisonment. Her experience revealed a system that used medical isolation to silence women who refused to conform to domestic roles. When isolation and the rest cure failed, doctors utilized powerful chemical sedation. Tinctures of laudanum and other opiates were handed out to quiet restlessness, leaving young women compliant and erasing the emotions society deemed unseemly. Victorian medicine weaponized the illusion of science to erase female agency, using diagnosis as a legal cage to enforce conformity. From the heavy Roman toga to the Victorian asylum, history shows a recurring fear: the raw, unpredictable energy of youth. For centuries, civilizations forged their youth to sustain their own power and survival, often at the direct expense of the individual's development. Today, we have the luxury of adolescence, a sanctioned window for growth that was once a forbidden luxury. But the mechanisms of control haven't vanished, they've simply become less visible. If you look closely at modern academic pressures and digital expectations, what invisible tools is our society using to forge you? Every day, we click "I agree" on 50 pages of digital text we haven't read. We stand in stagnant, unmoving lines for coffee. We wait quietly in sterile lobbies where the atmosphere feels designed to slow our breathing. Modern society possesses the technology to automate almost every one of these physical and administrative choke points. This creates a strange contradiction. In a world optimized for speed, we actively preserve rituals that do nothing but drain our time and focus. These bottlenecks exist because they establish authority. They are psychological tools built to remind us where we stand in relation to the systems we use. The blueprint for this behavior was drafted 2 millennia ago. The architects of the Roman Empire needed to manage massive populations without a standing army on every street corner, so they engineered a method of control that relied on the habits of the citizens themselves. We are currently executing a perfectly preserved Roman tradition of submission, following a behavioral script that was designed to feel like a natural part of daily life. Consider the intense moral outrage we feel when someone cuts a line at a coffee shop or an airport. Society briefly unites in silent judgment, treating the order of the queue as something sacred. This specific discipline was a Roman invention. Large, hungry crowds were forced into straight lines during public grain distributions, a tactic designed to prevent riots and manage desperation through enforced order. The line creates a sense of fairness by organizing human suffering. When the weight is equal for everyone, the frustration of the individual is channeled into the ritual, turning potential chaos into quiet resignation. Rome applied this same restrictive logic to the body. Today, we enforce professional dress codes, stiff collars, tight ties, and restrictive shoes in office environments that require absolutely no physical labor. This stems from the Roman toga. It was a heavy, awkward drape of fabric that was wildly impractical for movement. It functioned as a wearable signal of hierarchy, physically restricting the wearer while announcing their status in the state. Roman architecture used this same psychological weight. Towering archways and massive stone halls were designed to make humans feel physically tiny, encouraging compliance before a single word was ever spoken. These physical constraints, the queue, the dress code, the massive lobby, exhaust the body and prepare the mind for obedience. In the modern workplace, we rely on obscure titles and the automatic assumption of competence based purely on how long someone has held their seat. As the VO says, the posture of the consul, Rome turned titles into a cognitive shortcut. The posture of the consul and the formal scroll they carried were proof enough of power, bypassing the need to actually demonstrate competence to the public. In Roman society, challenging a higher-ranking title was framed as a disruption of order itself. We see the same rule today when an employee is labeled unprofessional for questioning the logic of a superior. This stability is further protected by politeness rituals, the scripted greetings and formal pleasantries we exchange every day. These scripts keep interactions predictable and shallow. If you break the routine by offering an honest, raw answer to a casual greeting, the room freezes. Society punishes authenticity when it threatens the social performance. Through these titles and manners, Rome successfully turned its citizens into an unpaid security force that aggressively maintains the hierarchy of the state. Consider the incredibly overwhelming paperwork required to start a job, rent an apartment, or simply update a modern smartphone. Rome prioritized ink and wax seals over human trust. They deliberately made legal language repetitive and dense because complexity signals authority. If a document is difficult to understand, we are more likely to submit to it. Roman administration layered offices upon offices, creating vast distance between a citizen's problem and the solution. This labyrinth is an engine of exhaustion. Navigating dead ends leaves people too tired to revolt. Resignation replaces action. When a form is rejected for a single typo in a 100-page document, the fault is placed on the individual, never the design. This administrative maze insulates the institution from blame. The system remains correct, while the citizen remains in error. Modern bureaucracy is a pacification engine. It is calibrated to make us blame our own lack of understanding, rather than realizing the structure itself was built to resist us. The frameworks we call professionalism and administrative law are ancient tools of management wearing modern masks. When we defend an inefficient rule by saying, "That's just the way it works," we are repeating a Roman sentiment. It is a phrase designed to protect the system from logical scrutiny. If an inefficient rule survives long enough, it becomes a part of the landscape. We stop asking who originally benefited from its creation. Rome's legions were responsible for its expansion, but its legacy was secured through the psychological force of habit. The next time a massive system wastes your time or energy, remember that you are witnessing the system working flawlessly. It is achieving exactly what it was designed to do 2,000 years ago. Imagine being plucked out of your modern life and dropped randomly into the timeline. You might land in a blazing frontier desert, the collapsing halls of an ancient temple, or a freezing, lawless wilderness. How long do you actually last? Hollywood suggests that a fast draw or sheer physical strength is the ticket to making it out alive. In history, those traits are often the fastest way to get yourself killed. The universe is deeply hostile, and human survival has never been a one-size-fits-all formula. The specific traits that make you a king in one century can turn you into a target in the next. We are going to examine 4 distinct historical ecosystems to see how survival really works. Because the most powerful weapon a human can possess is the ability to read the unique physics of their environment and adapt to them. In the American Wild West, formal law was a mirage. You navigated an environment where the water carried disease, and the weather swung between melting heat and lethal snowstorms. Look at the utilitarian appearance of this man. In a lawless land, cleanliness and wealth are liabilities. A crisp shirt marks you as a naive traveler straight off the train. Survival required a dirt palette of browns and grays, clothing so worn that it signaled you weren't worth the effort of robbing. Notice the observant postures of the men in this saloon. In this social ecosystem, extroverts and braggarts were the first to die. The real survivors were those who stayed in the corners, kept their voices low, and left the room before anyone bothered to learn their names. If a town became tense, the smartest tactical move was the quiet departure. You packed your gear before dawn and disappeared into the horizon without a single farewell. In a world without legal protection, you weaponized invisibility by suppressing your ego. Now, shift to the aristocratic states of ancient Rome. Here, the threat isn't physical violence. It is a catastrophic loss of political and social status. This stone relief captures the dextrarum junctio, the formal joining of hands. In Rome, this functioned as a contractual seal. These marriages were mechanisms for elite houses to lock in alliances, consolidate farmland, and secure the family name through heirs. The physical space between these two figures reflects the sine manu contract. Under this law, a wife remained part of her father's household rather than passing into her husband's authority. This legal separation allowed women to retain their own property and financial identity. Look at the stoic posture of this Roman matron. Because they held their own wealth, elite women wielded the threat of divorce and the withdrawal of massive dowries as political leverage. They were tacticians who could bankrupt a husband's career or pivot to a more powerful ally as the political winds shifted. When society is a rigid grid, survival belongs to those who strip emotion from human connection and master the ledger. We moved to Alexandria, where the Ptolemaic dynasty was a snake pit of sibling assassinations and familial betrayal, all while the Roman military loomed on the horizon. Unlike the Wild West, anonymity here meant being erased. To survive the Roman expansion, Cleopatra had to become impossible to ignore. Cleopatra had to maneuver around immovable Roman forces, exemplified by the cold, authoritative features of Julius Caesar in this bust. She utilized theatrical pageantry, styling herself as a living goddess and mastering 9 languages to captivate the generals who held the fate of her kingdom. This silver coin features the profiles of both Cleopatra and Mark Antony. By bearing children with Rome's most powerful men, she physically minted her bloodline into the empire's economy and propaganda, making her dynasty part of Rome's own future. When faced with a superior superpower, Cleopatra chose to survive by transforming herself into a highly visible, untouchable legend. We pivot finally to the Islamic Golden Age. This ecosystem spanned from Spain to Baghdad, connecting a diverse population that military force alone could not unite. Unity relied on a shared language of sound. The oud, with its fretless neck, allowed musicians to express the same complex melodic scales, the maqamat, whether they were in a palace in Cordoba or a market in Baghdad. This manuscript contains a geometric diagram of an instrument, proving that scholars like Al-Farabi treated music as a hard science. By mapping melodies to mathematical ratios, they created a standardized framework for sound that functioned across different cultures and ethnicities. These standardized musical theories filled mosques, markets, and homes. Because the music was grounded in the same scientific rules, it acted as cultural infrastructure, allowing a Persian poet, a Berber drummer, and an Arabic singer to share a single aesthetic vocabulary. To sustain a sprawling civilization, survival relies on translating raw data into a cultural rhythm that diverse people can recognize as their own. A rugged cowboy, a strategic Roman matron, a theatrical Egyptian queen, and a Baghdadi scholar. Their tactics were opposites, but they were playing the same game. Each recognized the specific constraints of their reality and hacked the system to their advantage. History is not a monument to the strongest or the loudest. Immortality belongs strictly to the ultimate adapters. If you turn on almost any historical drama, you are greeted with the same repetitive aesthetic. You see the muddy medieval peasant coughing in the rain, the mindless barbarians screaming on horseback, and the samurai defined entirely by a rigid, simplistic sense of honor. We are conditioned to view our ancestors through a lens of absolute bleakness. This gray version of history is a specific construction. It is the result of centuries of deliberate marketing campaigns. Renaissance and Enlightenment writers frequently characterized the eras preceding them as cultural pits, ensuring their own modern achievements looked brighter by comparison. To find a different story, we have to look past those later narratives and examine the primary evidence from medieval Europe, the Mongol steppes, and feudal Japan. Challenging these misconceptions replaces a patronizing caricature with the sophisticated reality of the people who actually lived in these environments. Consider the unshakable myth that the medieval world was an intellectual blackout, where everyone lived in terror of falling off a flat earth. This 13th century manuscript shows a figure holding a translucent blue globe. Medieval scholars had known the earth was round for centuries, continuing to teach the ancient Greek methods used to measure its circumference. Your average monk wasn't lying awake at night, terrified of cosmic cliffs. We also assume these people feared water. In reality, bathing was a frequent and social activity. Rivers and lakes served the countryside, while towns operated public bathhouses that functioned as communal hubs for gossip and business deals. Look at these figures bathing together in large wooden tubs. Bathhouses were common features of town life, and the elite often commissioned elaborate private baths, scented with rosemary, sage, and mint, the 14th century equivalent of a full-service spa. This desire for sensory detail extended into their architecture. Castles were often plastered and painted in bright primary colors, while the nobility consumed food heavily seasoned with expensive imported spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. Medieval Europe was a society functioning through established universities, intricate legal codes, and significant technical innovation, from mechanical clocks to the engineering of Gothic cathedrals. On the Mongolian steppe, the caricature shifts from the filthy peasant to the mindless barbarian. But the Mongol Empire did not function on bloodlust alone. It relied on highly sophisticated social codes. This is a gur, or yurt, isolated in an ocean of grass. In an environment where a night without shelter could be a death sentence, hospitality became a sacred political obligation. Sharing a bowl of arog, fermented mare's milk, was a ritual that bound strangers together and functioned as a primary tool for statecraft. This culture also afforded remarkable autonomy to those who could defend it. Kutalun, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, was a prominent military commander who controlled her own marital destiny. She announced she would only marry a man who could defeat her in a wrestling match. This portrait shows the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who documented Kutalun's life. He recorded that she remained entirely undefeated, eventually accumulating a personal fortune of 10,000 horses through her wrestling wagers. Survival on the steppe required calculated diplomacy and the strength to enforce personal boundaries, a far cry from the image of simple savagery. We see the same calculated pragmatism in feudal Japan. We often frame samurai warfare as a series of honorable, one-dimensional duels, but the 1614 siege of Osaka was a masterclass in geopolitical strategy. This is Tokugawa Ieyasu. He wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking to secure his family's dynasty for the next 2 centuries by systematically dismantling his rivals, the Toyotomi clan. To do that, he had to overcome Osaka Castle. Look at these massive, steep stone walls and the deep water moats. It was designed to funnel attackers into deadly kill zones. Tokugawa began with a psychological assault, dragging heavy European-style artillery into position to pound the interior of the castle day and night, wearing down the defenders' morale through constant noise and fire. These blue lines on the schematic represent the outer moats that made the fortress impenetrable. Tokugawa eventually offered a peace treaty that seemed generous, but it contained one crucial condition. He would help the Toyotomi repair their defenses by filling in these outer moats. As soon as the ink was dry, Tokugawa's laborers shoveled earth and rubble into the water, turning these moats into flat ground and rendering the castle totally vulnerable. When he returned with his army for a final assault a few months later, the Toyotomi had no defense left. This was a victory of engineering and deception as much as steel. A colorful medieval castle, a Mongol wrestling ring, and a calculated Japanese siege line all point to the same truth. This folding screen shows a massive, crowded battlefield, but look at the individual figures. These were people navigating complex social hierarchies and high-stakes survival strategies. The grayness we associate with the past is what remains after time and bias strip away the paint. When we look past the Hollywood filter, we find a history that is inherently more vibrant and human. For much of the ancient world, surviving the day meant navigating a landscape of total unpredictability. Sudden disease, crop failures, and arbitrary weather patterns dictated who lived and who died. We responded by building frameworks. Humans constructed elaborate social and physical structures to impose order on an environment that offered no inherent safety. These systems manifested as magical defenses against cosmic threats and as rigid social rituals designed to make the behavior of our neighbors predictable. We populated the map with calendars, invented strict categories, and forged command structures to mitigate the unknown. These tools functioned as a buffer, turning a terrifying universe into a manageable one. To understand our past, we have to look at these strict rules and the specific moments when forces emerged that shattered them. The Babylonians tried to domesticate fate by treating the sky as a spreadsheet. They cataloged eclipses and cloud patterns in dense cuneiform script, turning celestial events into data they could interpret. Ancient Egyptians developed a different kind of control. They engineered magical technology to repel disease, accidents, and spiritual threats. Artifacts like this blue-winged scarab functioned as spiritual armor. These amulets were worn to channel divine energy, providing the wearer with a sense of security against daily hazards. This desire for order extended to the animal kingdom. Ancient societies sought to neutralize the wild by integrating animals into their domestic hierarchies. Roman households used pets as status symbols and protectors. In this mosaic, the tethered guard dog represents the literal domestication and restraint of natural violence. In Mesoamerica, animals were integrated into the spiritual world. This human-faced dog vessel depicts a guide tasked with escorting the dead through the afterlife. From carved amulets to tethered dogs, these systems were designed to put a collar on the unpredictable forces of nature. This urge for order also applied to internal behavior. Alcohol was used as a tool to enforce social hierarchy and commune with the gods, but it was governed by strict laws. Ancient Greeks mandated specific dilution ratios of water to wine. During a symposium, like the one depicted on this vessel, a host dictated exactly how much everyone drank to ensure the gathering remained intellectual. When leaders abandoned this moderation, the structure of the state often followed. Nero's reign was marked by theatrical catastrophes that were directly linked to his rejection of these traditional boundaries. Even Alexander the Great was vulnerable. A massive bout of overindulgence unseated him at age 32, proving that a lack of internal discipline could collapse an empire from within. These drinking customs show that ancient societies recognized the loss of internal control as a threat equal to any external chaos. In the 18th century, the captured female pirate disrupted established boundaries. She represented a variable that the existing legal system was not prepared to handle. The British legal machine was highly efficient at hanging male pirates. It was a standardized pipeline designed for a specific type of criminal. But the capture of women like Anne Bonny caused immediate bureaucratic paralysis. Judges were forced to search for legal precedents that didn't exist, leading to a breakdown in the courtroom's efficient logic. Female pirates used a legal loophole called pleading the belly. Because the state could not execute a pregnant woman, this claim created a biological detour that stopped the execution pipeline. Other women bypassed the system by negotiating pardons or turning informant, using their knowledge of pirate networks to trade for their freedom. By exploiting loopholes the state hadn't anticipated, these women jammed the gears of the legal machine. They forced a rigid system to confront a reality it wasn't designed to handle. The state responded to these anomalies by trying to force them back into acceptable boxes. Authorities utilized domestic reform. They forced marriages and quiet imprisonment to neutralize the influence of female pirates. When reform failed, the state turned to public executions or deliberate historical erasure. By deleting their names from the record, officials tried to re-establish the illusion of absolute control. This erasure often backfired. Instead of disappearing, these women became icons of independence, celebrated precisely because they broke the rules. We build systems to find security in a chaotic world. But history is driven forward by the anomalies, the people who defied the roles assigned to them and forced the world to change its shape. Scroll through any social media feed today, and you'll find a predictable rotation of grievances. Teenagers are chaotic and disrespectful. People are dangerously obsessed with vanity and the latest trends. Standardized schools are failing students who don't fit the mold. These complaints feel modern, but the teenager breaking curfew to cause trouble is a 14th century blacksmith's apprentice. The fashionista bankrupting themselves for a new look is a Roman senator from the 1st century. And the brilliant student failing his classes is an aristocratic schoolboy from the 1880s. Historians call this chronological snobbery, the assumption that because we have smartphones and electricity, we are a different species than the people who came before us. Strip away the modern tech. Beneath the chainmail, the togas, and the tweed, human behavior has remained static for thousands of years. Look at the ancient Mediterranean. We often imagine ancient clothing as simple, flowing robes designed for the heat, but fashion and beauty routines served as the original tools for establishing a social identity. Ancient Egyptians followed elaborate daily rituals. They applied thick black coal to their eyes, using minerals that provided antibacterial protection from the desert sun. They stored these pigments in expensive, custom-crafted stone containers, treating makeup as a luxury and a necessity. Roman elites used impractical garments to communicate rank. Senators wore the toga, a heavy, draped garment with bulky folds nearly impossible to arrange alone. Wearing one proved you were wealthy enough to own servants and high status enough to avoid manual labor. Powerful figures like Julius Caesar set the trends for the entire empire. He drove a massive demand for luxury pearls and spent considerable time carefully combing his hair forward to hide his receding hairline from the public. Ancient fashion operated as a strictly enforced visual language. While we often associate our obsession with luxury with modern capitalism, the impulse to signal status through appearance was a dominant force long before the first corporation existed. That exact same unchanging behavior defined medieval Europe. At this time, the concept of a teenager didn't exist. At 14, you were handed the tools of a trade and expected to perform as a productive adult immediately. Despite grueling 12-hour workdays, medieval apprentices still possessed the restless energy and poor judgment we associate with youth today. No amount of labor could overwrite their impulses. Adolescents deliberately chose outrageously styled clothing to provoke their elders. They bought shoes with long, curled, pointed toes called polanes. Entirely impractical for work, they were the perfect tool for teenage rebellion. Town officials dealt with constant headaches from the youth. Curfews were ignored, property was vandalized, and massive, violent brawls frequently broke out under the guise of medieval football matches. No volume of strict labor laws, religious sermons, or town curfews could suppress these outbursts. The messy transition to adulthood remained a constant, even when society demanded total compliance from children. In Victorian Britain, young Winston Churchill was born into the immense aristocratic wealth of Blenheim Palace. Despite this, he suffered from deep emotional neglect, as his socialite parents were often distant and preoccupied with public life. His father, Lord Randolph, viewed Winston's academic struggles as a sign of permanent laziness and failure. He feared his son lacked the discipline to ever achieve anything of note. At the prestigious Harrow School, Churchill failed to grasp Latin and math, and he frequently argued with teachers rather than memorizing rules. To his instructors, he was simply an untidy, stubborn student who refused to follow instructions. He failed his military entrance exams twice before finally passing. He only succeeded when he was allowed to focus on his specific fixations, military history and cavalry tactics. Instructors dismissed his stubbornness as a lack of discipline. Yet that refusal to comply and his intense fixations forged the resilience and rhetoric that eventually anchored a nation. The ancient senator, the medieval prankster, and the failing Victorian schoolboy all converge at a single point. Their actions were driven by the same timeless search for status, independence, and purpose. History is not a list of dates. It's a mirror reflecting our present back at us. The next time you feel frustrated by modern vanity or the chaos of youth, take comfort. Humanity has survived this same script for millennia. After the collapse of Rome, Europe became a free-for-all of raids and revenge. In a world where a neighbor's sword was as unpredictable as the next plague, existence was fragile, as durable as a breadstick. You couldn't just hide. Long-term survival meant projecting enough strength to convince the world that attacking you was a mistake. You had to deter threats before they reached your door. But broadcasting that strength was difficult. There were no mass media networks, no digital footprints, and no permanent borders. Power was only as real as the distance your voice could travel. Our ancestors solved this by physically encoding their authority into the world. They engineered art, ceremony, and stone to build an armor of status that scaled from the skin on their arms to the mountains they ruled. Viking women often operated as merchants and negotiators, managing trade routes from the northern fjords to the markets of the Caspian Sea. They faced sea storms, raids, and sudden death far from home. These women wore their protection. The dark blue and green inked patterns described by travelers functioned as a living armor, offering a psychological endurance that physical steel could not provide. Specific symbols, coiled serpents, intricate runic prayers, and family lineages were carved into the skin to mark identity and grief. A tattoo wasn't an ornament, it was a visible oath to a god. This visual language provided vital credentials across borders. These marks ensured a woman was recognized as a member of a powerful trading network, offering a layer of safety in a perilous world. In a culture without written records, the human body became a ledger of identity, one that survived where paper would rot and voices would fail. In ancient Rome, the primary threat shifted from the elements to the ego. Danger didn't come from a raid, it came from your political peers. This fresco shows the rigid reality of a Roman meal. While later moralists painted these as chaotic debauchery, the Roman convivium functioned as a political arena. Authority was carved directly into objects like this silver cup. A host's connections were broadcast through imported delicacies and meticulous seating charts that defined a guest's exact standing in the empire. One dinner could secure a dynasty or ruin an enemy. Emperor Caligula weaponized these feasts, using calculated extravagance to humiliate senators and remind them that their comfort existed only by his grace. The Roman dining room was an arena of psychological dominance. Survival in the capital required mastering this theater of luxury and submission. As power scaled up to the geopolitical level, the wooden fort, a hopeful shrug of timber, gave way to the stone castle. These were humanity's magnificent stone middle fingers to any would-be invader. This is the White Tower in London, a wall thick enough to outlive your grandchildren. Its exterior was engineered to make attackers feel hopeless long before they even reached the gate. Inside, the geometry was even more cruel. Castle staircases spiraled clockwise as they rose. Because most soldiers were right-handed, an attacker climbing upward found their sword arm pinned against the central column. The defender above, however, could swing with an unobstructed arc. But defense was only the starting point. These structures were built to advertise superiority, forcing every villager to look up at the Lord's house while they plowed the fields. The stone castle was feudalism carved in granite, a permanent broadcast that obedience is safety and rebellion is suicide. King Gentius of Illyria serves as a stark case study of what happens when these fortifications meet a superior force. He attempted to survive by wedging his kingdom between the rival appetites of Rome and Macedon. This aerial view shows the ruins of Scodra, a fortress perched on a strategic hilltop. Gentius used this elevation to project power and defy the expansion of the Roman Republic. He attempted to bolster this physical defense with political ceremony, forging a critical alliance with the Kingdom of Macedon to halt the Roman advance. A note of irony, that carefully constructed armor collapsed when Macedon withheld the promised gold. Without resources, Gentius was isolated, and the disciplined Roman legions broke his walls in a matter of weeks. Physical and political fortifications are only as strong as the human loyalties binding them. Gentius was defeated, his fleet burned, and his family paraded through Rome in chains. All of these mediums are physically vulnerable. Flesh decays, and the strategic banquets of the Roman elite were easily twisted into myths of sin by their political enemies. Even stone giants that laughed at ladders met their end here. The moment the cannon arrived, 5 centuries of architectural security collapsed into piles of rubble in a single afternoon. But while the tools failed, their underlying purpose succeeded. The drive to secure a permanent legacy by shaping the landscape proved to be humanity's most enduring instinct. This obsession with altitude persists in the modern skyline. Just as the medieval peasant looked up to find their lord, Corporate architecture uses vertical scale to project authority. The height isn't for defense, it's for domination. Walls eventually crumble, but the desire to carve "I was here" into the world is eternal. We're still building fortresses. We've just changed the material.